Okay. All right, 2 Samuel chapter 2. Last week we finished up with verses 8 to 11 of chapter 2 of 2 Samuel, and in these verses we have mention of the three key players so far in 2 Samuel: David, Abner, and Ishbosheth. David is the anointed king of Israel, succeeding Saul, who died on the battlefield along with his sons. And however, at this time, David, as we've mentioned, is king only over the house of Judah, not over all of the nation of Israel. And chapter 2, verse 4 of 2 Samuel says this: Then the men of Judah came, and there they anointed David king over the house of Judah. And then in verses 10 and 11 it says, Ishbosheth, Saul's son, was 40 years old when he began to reign over Israel, and he reigned 2 years. Only the house of Judah followed David. And the time that David was king in Hebron over the house of Judah was 7 years and 6 months. So Abner, who was a cousin of King Saul and was also the captain of King Saul's army, he disobeyed God in making Abner, in disobeying God, Abner made Ishbosheth king over the rest of Israel. That was, remember, the reason that Israel was given a king is because they said they wanted to be like all the other nations. And in the other nations, when the king died, if he had any sons, his oldest would ascend to the throne. And so in this case, following that scenario of the other nations, Ishbosheth, who was the only living son now of King Saul, would have the rightful place as the king. He would have the throne. However, because of Saul's disobedience, remember, Samuel came along and he had anointed David king to replace the disobedient and godless, or ungodly, should I say, Saul. So, and Ishbosheth was Saul's, like I just mentioned, was Saul's remaining son. Now let me read verses 8 through 11 of chapter 2 as a reiteration of what we finished up with last week. But Abner, the son of Ner, commander of Saul's army, took Ishbosheth the son of Saul and brought him over to Mahanaim, and he made him king over Gilead, over the Asherites, over Jezreel, over Ephraim, over Benjamin, and over all Israel. Ishbosheth, Saul's son, was 40 years old when he began to reign over Israel, reigned only 2 years. And only the house of Judah followed David, and the time that David was king in Hebron over the house of Judah was 7.5 years. Now Abner, verse 12 of chapter 2, now Abner, let's stop there. Now then, to continue on, verses 12 to 17 of this second chapter tell us about Abner challenging David's army. And when Abner made Ishbosheth king, he was actually, even though maybe he didn't realize it, or maybe he did, he was actually declaring war on David, and he knew it. But by now Abner had all the tribes except Judah behind him, and he felt he could easily defeat David. Not only in battle, but he could then take over the entire kingdom. And so, confident of victory, Abner called for a contest between the two armies to be held at the Great Cistern about 23 miles north of Gibeon. And this was similar to the challenge Goliath issued when he called for one of Saul's soldiers to fight him. Remember that from 1 Samuel 17, verses 8 through 10, where Goliath called out in so many words. He says, let's not have everybody perish. I'll fight for the Philistines. You send somebody to fight for the Israelites. And so they sent David. But you see, in this case, Abner was rebelling against God while David was God's chosen leader. So that's the big difference. Now, this is also in these verses here that we're going to read in a moment. This is the first time we meet a fellow by the name of Joab, who's David's nephew and the commander of David's army. And the two armies met at the reservoir, and 12 soldiers from the army of Benjamin faced 12 men from Judah, and all 24 men were killed, Scripture says. And that day the battlefield received a new name, the field of sharp edges, or the field of daggers. And then Joab and Abner wasted no time getting their troops in battle formation, and the Scripture says the battle that day was very fierce. Abner was defeated that day, and it was just a portent or just evidence of things yet to come. So let me read verses 12 to 17 of chapter 2 here of 2 Samuel. Now Abner the son of Ner and the servants of Ishbosheth the son of Saul went out from Mahanaim to Gibeon, and Joab, who we're first introduced to him here, the son of Zeruiah, and the servants of David went out and met them by the pool of Gibeon. So they sat down, one on one side of the pool and the other on the other side of the pool. And then Abner said to Joab, "Let the young men now arise and compete before us." And Joab said, "Okay, let them arise." So they arose and went over by number, 12 from Benjamin, followers of Ishbosheth the son of Saul, and 12 from the servants of David. And each one grasped his opponent by the head and thrust his sword in his opponent's side, so they fell down together. Therefore that place was called the field of sharp swords, which is in Gibeon. So there was a very fierce battle that day, and Abner and the men of Israel were beaten before the servants of David. Now, in verse 18, this next verse in this second chapter, we are introduced to someone else for the first time, a soldier of David's army by the name of Asahel, who was also one of David's nephews. A lot of relative, kinfolk stuff going on here. Now, whether on his own initiative or at his brother's orders, Asahel went after Abner with the goal of killing him. And he knew that slaying the enemy general could mean confusing and scattering the whole enemy army. And then if Joab commanded the fleet-footed Asahel to go after Abner, perhaps he was thinking of his own future. So we got a lot of deception going on here too. For Abner might very well threaten to take Joab's position as head of the army, because Abner was a great warrior in his own right. Now, the record, you okay, babe? Okay. Now, the record, biblical record, seems to make it clear that Abner, he really has no desire to harm or kill the lad. But Asahel was persistent. And first, Abner told him to turn aside and take what he wanted from one of the dead enemy soldiers, and then he warned him that if he killed him, this would create a blood feud that could cause trouble for years to come. And Abner knew that Joab had no desire to begin a possible lifelong family conflict. It was bad enough that Joab and Abner were rival generals, let alone they're becoming this major conflict. And so Asahel still refused to end his pursuit of Abner, so Abner killed him. Abner killed him. Notice verses 18 to 23 here in chapter 2. Now the three sons of Zeruiah were there, Joab and Abishai and Asahel. And Asahel was as fleet of foot as a wild gazelle. So he pursued Abner, and in going he did not turn to the right hand or to the left from following Abner. Then Abner looked behind him and said, "Are you Asahel?" And he answered, "I am." And Abner said to him, "Turn aside to your right hand or to your left, and lay hold on one of the young men and take his armor for yourself." But he would not turn aside from following him. And so Abner said again to him, "Turn aside from following me. Why should I strike you to the ground? How then could I face your brother Joab?" However, he refused to turn aside. And therefore Abner struck him in the stomach with the blunt end of the spear, so that the spear came out of his back, and he fell down dead. And he died there on the spot. So it was that as many as he came to the place where Asahel fell down and died, they just kind of stood still. And they probably muttered a prayer, or if there were other people with him, they said, "Okay, this is where Asahel died." Foolish death. A foolish death. Did not need to take place. So then, Abner has been defeated. So what's he do? He calls for a truce. And Asahel's two brothers, Joab and Abishai, must have been following close behind, because they took up the pursuit of Abner, and no doubt determined to avenge the blood of their brother. But Abner's troops rescued him, and he and the Benjamites retreated to the hill of Ammah. And like I just mentioned, Abner knew he was beaten, so he called for a truce. He may have suspected that the death of Asahel would encourage Joab and Abishai to stop fighting and take care of his burial. Judah and Benjamin were brothers, both sons of Jacob, and why should brother fight against brother? David?
What's the significance of taking the armor from a fallen soldier? Why did he offer?
Bounty. Remember David when he killed Goliath? He chopped off David's head, and then he took his sword. David took Goliath's sword and took it to his tent. And then later that sword was hidden in the temple, and then later it was brought out. And so it was kind of a bounty, a trophy, if you please. And so if Asahel would have killed Abner, then he would have taken some of Abner's armor as proof that he had killed Abner. And Abner, and in those days, especially if you weren't, a top dog as far as a warrior, and you were able to take down somebody who was, then if you had some kind of a trophy to prove it, that was kind of a feather in your cap. And so Abner, knowing that, says, "Look, just here's somebody who's dead, just take some of their armor, and if it's a trophy you want, and go about it." But
Okay, so I think I get it now. It's a trophy, but it's also proof that you were in battle.
mm-hmm. Exactly. Now, Joab knew the heart of David, and that David wanted unity and peace, not division and war. So he blew the trumpet and stopped his troops from pursuing the enemy. He said to Abner, "God only knows what would have happened if you hadn't spoken, for we would have chased you all night if necessary." And then Abner and his men walked all night to return to Mahanaim, and Joab and his army returned to Hebron, stopping a Bethlehem along the way to give Ahishel a proper burial. So let's read here in verses 24 and following. "So Joab and Abishai also pursued Abner And the sun was going down when they came to the hill of Ammah, which is before Giah by the road to the wilderness of Gibeon. Now the children of Benjamin gathered together behind Abner and became a unit and took their stand on top of a hill. Then Abner called to Joab and said, "Shall the sword devour forever? Do you not know that it will be bitter in the latter end? How long will it be then until you tell the people to return from pursuing their brethren?" In other words, like we just mentioned, this could have gone on and on and on and on, back and forth, back and forth. And Joab said, "As God lives, unless you had spoken, surely then by morning all the people would have given up pursuing their brethren." So Joab blew a trumpet, and all the people stood still and did not pursue Israel anymore, nor did they fight anymore. Then Abner and his men went on all that night through the plain, crossed over the Jordan, and went through all Bithron, and they came to Mahanaim. So then Joab returned from pursuing Abner, and when he had gathered all the people together, there were missing of David's servants 19 men and Asahel. But the servants of David had struck down of Benjamin and Abner's men 360 men who died. So you can get an indication there of what took place in just that short by duration battle. David didn't lose all that many men. Abner lost a pile of guys. But the servants of David, then they took up, verse 32, they took up Asahel and buried him in his father's tomb, which was in Bethlehem. And Joab and his men went all night, and they came to Hebron at daybreak. Now, it's a short lesson today because I had to also put together a sermon for this morning. But I want to mention this. The conflict between the followers of Saul and the followers of David was not limited to the battle recorded in chapter 2. It says there that, when in verse 32, it has the appearance of giving us a hint that perhaps there was not going to be that much more war, but that was not the case. Hostilities continued between the two royal houses. The house of Saul, who was now dead, but still held some influence, and the house of David, who was now the new anointed king, and we're going to see in chapter 3 where he gets anointed. So hostilities continued between those two royal houses, with David gradually gaining control over all of Israel. But not only could David be referred to as a shepherd king, but David can be referred to as a warrior king. And so it's important to realize that. And let me read verse 1 of chapter 3 to substantiate what I just said, and then we'll wind it up for today. Now there was a long war between the house of Saul and the house of David. But David grew stronger and stronger, and the house of Saul grew weaker and weaker. Kind of a commentary on what's going to take place as David continues to gain influence. And remember what we said either last week or maybe in the weeks previous to that even though David had been on the run from Saul for 10 years or more, yet, that was the bad news. The good news was that that God was building into David kingly things. In looking at Saul, he could see what not to do as a king. See? From the time I trusted the Lord until I actually got into the pastoral ministry, it was a lot of years. Because I did not want to do that. I enjoyed preaching, but I wasn't necessarily wanting to be a pastor. But what I did do, and this was at the advice of the fellow who discipled me, who originally suggested that God might be calling me to a pastor. I said, I don't want to do that. And he said, well, I can understand that, so here's what you need to do. You need to pay close attention to the pastors that come across your path and pay attention to what not to do as a pastor. Carol.
I can, excuse me, attest in my own life that the lessons I have learned within my growing up, between living life with my mom and dad and then living life with my dad and stepmom after my mom passed, that the negative lessons I learned of I'm not doing that
Yeah.
to my husband or children when I
Yeah.
have them are as equally powerful as
Yeah.
the positive ones I
Yeah.
did. They were, it's fun, but
Yeah.
they certainly have value.
See, in that philosophy of paying close attention to people and situations so we know not what to do or what not to do, not only has to do with just life in general, but in the ministry as well. And I'd like to think that I've accomplished a certain amount of success in ministry. And one of the reasons for that, Pastor and I were talking about this not all that long ago, is observing what not to do. I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to do that. I've been associated with some pastors, not necessarily, I mean, maybe there was one that every time you turn around, he was lording stuff over the parishioners and was not a shepherd. God, above all, calls a pastor to be not only a teacher, but a shepherd. A shepherd. And so that's one of the things God had shared with Peter, Jesus had shared with Peter when that little time he had by the seaside, when he asked Peter, do you love me? 3 times he asked him. And each time he was trying to get across to him, well, you're to feed my sheep. You're to be one of the shepherds of the flock, see. And and then Peter turned out to be just that. Peter turned out to be an excellent shepherd by the way Jesus had challenged him. And so we need to pay attention to the things, to what not to do. And David did that. And we're going to see that above all, David was a shepherd. Saul was not. Saul really didn't have a care for the people. But David, he emulated the characteristics of a shepherd. You see that in the Psalms that God used him to write, the way he conducted himself. And so let's be determined to learn to what not to do as we observe people. I'm not going to do that. I said that in raising my family. My stepdad was an excellent provider, but he spent very little time with his kids. Never went to any of our sports events or anything like that. And I determined that's not the way I was going to do it. See? And he was a drinker. I determined that I wasn't going to do that. And had a foul mouth. I determined I wasn't going to do that. See? And so there are a lot of things that we can learn not to do. Okay? Long war between the house of Saul and the house of David, but David grew stronger and stronger, and the house of Saul grew weaker and weaker. That's all I got this time. We had a question?
No, I had something to share. I think you're all aware that I have a sister who's in prison for life down in the Chowchilla area. She got life without parole for being an accessory to a murder that she was not even there, but she was supposedly had knowledge of it. I'm having a hard time forming a thought right now. But she had applied for a pardon. I have written to the governor numerous times and had other friends write to the governor. And the night before Thanksgiving, she was called into the warden's office and said that she had either a call from the governor or a message from the governor. Her sentence has been commuted. And it has been reduced from life without parole to 35 years. She has served 34 plus years, so she just has to finish out her 35th year, which will be like in the next 6 months, and she'll be free. So, and during her time in prison, she has worked with the chaplain's office, she's worked in hospice, and she's totally reformed and has been since shortly after she got there. She gave her life to Christ fully, and for all these years, you know, she's been just taking up taxpayer money, basically. And she now is facilitating Bible study, Beth Moore and Kay Arthur Bible studies for the girls, and just recently has taken on the job of training service dogs. So she has a brand new little puppy that sleeps in the room with her, and she's training that dog to be a service dog. So everything that she has done, the whole time she's been there, has been for the good, but yet she was passed over so many times by creeps who would be let out to, you know, re-offend, which seems so unfair, but God, in his time, we don't know why, has waited until now, and so it'll be, you know, sometime, I would think by spring or around there, that she will be released. And it's going to be a real culture shock for her, because she went in 1983, and they were not allowed, like, internet or computers or telephones or any, yeah, so she's totally unfamiliar with all that stuff. When she writes letters, it's on a typewriter. And they do have a new system now, it's called JPay, where you can pay ahead for stamps, and it's like email, where I've been able to communicate with her that way. Otherwise, for the last how many years, we've had to pay for a phone service, a special phone service that goes through the jail. It's amazing the security that they have. And anyhow, this was the night before Thanksgiving that she got this news, and then I got the news on Thanksgiving morning, which is like, you know, gave me a whole new reason to be thankful. Yeah. Pardon? Were reserved for employees, but they saw fit to honor her at one of these banquets just for her service.